Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, with the U.S. failing in trying to force both Russia and China to capitulate through tariff demands, it appears that Trump's pivot towards India to be the monkey wrench over BRICS is quickly failing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would go as far as saying this is significantly strengthening the BRICS alliance and it's standing up to US tariffs in the process. And we've obviously seen very clear examples of the to do with the Ukraine war that one of the tried and tested routes as far as the US was concerned, which is failing, was to financially squeeze Russia into I wouldn't say capitulating over Ukraine, but being less forceful in their demands to end the war. And therefore, they thought, well, we'll put huge pressure on the Chinese and the Indians with regards to tariffs, which was ridiculous, as we'll explain in a minute. And they both turned around and said, no, this is not happening. Forget it. It's absolutely ridiculous. You're not dictating to us how we conduct business. And furthermore, of course, the whole tariff debacle is, yeah, put 100% tariffs on Indian exports to the US. Well, that just means everything costs 100% more. It doesn't affect the Indians or the Chinese in any way, shape, or form. And this idiotic philosophy with regards to tariffs really is incredible that someone really hasn't pointed out to them the absurdity of what they're doing. But I think what's interesting from a BRICS perspective, and there has been people suggesting that Trump was, excuse me, going after India and going after China, particularly because they're BRICS members, and the United States is terrified of BRICS. This is true, and they're terrified what the alliance is standing for and what it's capable of achieving, because after all, it's collectively produces far more global output than the G7 does. And of course, it has access to enormous resources. And from India's perspective, yes, I'm less inclined to want to say they've been playing both sides. They've been sitting on the fence thinking we can benefit from both the unipolar world and the multipolar world. And now there's the realization that's not going to work because with the United States, you're either with them or you're against them. And if you're against them, then the meaning you're backing multipolar world, then they're no ally anyway. And frankly, the United States doesn't have allies anyway, as we know. They just have vassal states who do the bidding of the US as and when Washington requires it. But for India, there's some very obvious reasons why it makes abundant sense for them to want to effectively, I wouldn't say abandon the United States and the West, but to rethink their relationship. And that relates to the fact they need enormous amounts of resources, not just oil uh, and gas for that matter. And who's going to be able to provide those resources for them? Well, Russia and China for that matter. India is the largest population in the world, so it needs huge amounts of food. Who's one of the bread baskets of the world? Uh, Russia, who's increasingly producing more and more food as well. China, for example, they also can import an enormous amount of agricultural produce from Brazil, who's obviously part of BRICS as well. And for India, there's a lot of potential for them to grow their relations and have larger export markets with countries in BRICS or in the global south as opposed to countries in the west. So they can form relationships with reliable partners. And that is something, of course, the United States is deeply shocked about because they expect, as they have done historically, that nations would just capitulate, would do as they were told, as they have done historically. But now countries like India are refusing to do so. China, clearly Russia's kind of an irrelevance in regard to this because they've totally decoupled from the West, except for the things the United States and Europe wants, even though they're supposed to be unsanctioned. But also this includes Brazil, and definitely there is a mood inside BRICS now that we need to have a collective approach to dealing with issues related to the United States vis-a-vis things like sanctions or tariffs, or the US trying to meddle and manipulate countries in the regions they reside in to create that level of instability, which has historically been something the United States has thrived upon by implementing such negative foreign policy.
Exactly. And it's kind of interesting because, Modi is one of the most shrewd politicians and leaders that we've seen in the last 20 years. He has been able to juggle sitting on the fence, playing both sides. And it's interesting that I don't want to say interesting, but it's fascinating that the Trump administration completely fails to see that if they do just a little bit of encouragement, India is going to be more to the side of the West than it would be towards their partners in BRICS. However, as we've seen with the Trump administration, it's escalate to de escalate, but really it's rather do it my way or the highway. And since they failed to be able to force China with threats of tariffs, they've haven't been able to get Russia to do their bidding and do what they want. They've switched tactics. First to go after Brazil with Lula. And Lula is as defiant as they come, and he's virtually given the middle finger, quickly looking towards BRICS partners to transition trade. And India now was the key focus that the Trump administration wanted to use to try to force Russia to capitulate. And Modi, like I said, who's been on that fence, is suddenly realizing, just as you pointed out, the U.S. does not have allies; they have vassals. We saw this with Europe, the quote unquote trade deal, where Europe got nothing and pretty much is siphoning the wealth. And even Besant said this on an interview a few days ago that the Europe to the US is one big sovereign wealth fund to do with as Trump sees fit. And if that doesn't wake up, a country like India, and interesting enough, when you take a look at India's productivity and their GDP, where China actually produces goods, sells to the world, India is producing services. You take a look at their brain drain. A lot of the intellectuals go elsewhere. Microsoft and who's the other? Google are run by Indian nationals who became American citizens, and they run the corporations now. We have India where a lot of the customer service desks have been offshored to India. They provide the service part where China provided the productivity and industry, manufacturing. So Modi has is suddenly coming to the realization that he does have allies if he decides to choose and stand with them, but the U.S. is actually making it very easy for Modi to make that decision, which then strengthens the BRICS even more because they already have Brazil wanting to move increasingly, and de-dollarization is already into full scale.
Yeah, and also importantly, from India's perspective, there's a realization about the fragility of security in that whole region, including Central Asia, including West Asia, and the need for these countries to not only integrate with regards to their security needs through BRICS, but also the integration between BRICS and the SCO, hence why Modi rolls up into China at the end of the month at the SCO summit. And it's interesting, Modi came out and talked about that, that he wants to have a defense shield in the next decade put over all of India to protect it. Now, who's he going to work with in that regard? Probably the Russians and to some extent the Chinese and other, certainly not the United States. And India is also looking at wanting to have made in India semiconductors that will be available in the market within months. I mean, because they want to become more self-reliable, where are they going to get the components from to build those semiconductors? They get them from the Chinese, or to some extent the Russians as well, and other global South countries, rather than going, we're going to be dependent on the United States. The other thing they want to do is to be able to manufacture their own fighter jets using their own jet engines. And the list goes on. They're now more and more wanting to become more independent, to stand up for the rights of their own sovereignty, but also realizing that being part of BRICS and the SCO, which they are of both, is actually extremely important and provides additional levels of security and obviously to do with trade and commerce. And it's interesting how actually Modi made the point by saying that India alone accounts for more than 50% of the world's real-time transactions through India's UPI. Now, that will probably surprise people. It shouldn't surprise people, but it will. And for anyone who doesn't know, the UPI is the Unified Payment Interface. It's an Indian instant payment system, and it was implemented, I think, back in 2016. And therefore, the argument as far as India is concerned, is this again is another sort of slight at the dollar. I mean, because there's no doubt that India is trading with Russia in rupees and rubles. It's trading with China now in the yuan. And it wants to internationalize to whatever extent it can the rupee in the process. I mean, and therefore, foreigners can also use the UPI in the future. So this is something that India is now beginning to assert itself and wants to not be perceived as being a doormat for the United States as it has been in the past, and realizing pretending to be having strong relations with the United States when those relations are just a marriage of convenience for the US because they think they can use that relationship to cause damage to China, to try and cause damage to Russia, and therefore this is failing, and this is causing enormous problems for the US because every time they try to implement something, they think that's going to damage the multipolar world, damage BRICS, damage the SCO. It all blows up in their face, and these countries are now realizing finally that the way forward is, if at some point you can have trade cooperation with the US based on win-win cooperation and mutual respect, then fine. But until that happens, we're wasting our time and we're not going to bother considering doing it. Now, of course, we have to also mention the fact there is people who said, well, Modi will say a lot of things, but there needs to be a sustained development in this regard for a period of years, and not, statements that are made and then contradicted 5 minutes later. And I'm with people on that in that regard. But if India wants to have a chance of really developing, then it needs to be able to work with all partners around the world. And at some point, hopefully, that will include the United States. But it can in no way, shape, or form seriously imagine that the United States is an ally as things stand, because nothing could be further from the truth.
Indeed, and it's kind of interesting because as Modi, he's sort of the grandfather over BRICS, the voice of reason who works both sides. There was a point someone I was reading recently made is that India has presented itself from the very beginning as the voice of the global South, hosting the first summits back in January 2023. And it sought to play this role by virtue of being the most populous, commanding the largest economy. But that has changed. And it's interesting that within a couple weeks of the tariffs being implemented on them by the Trump administration, it has actually forced India now to revamp or seek to revamp their tax and regulatory system and look more towards self-reliance. And with that being the case, uh, you know, except for Europe, which is sort of forced to, Japan, which would like to disconnect but hasn't so far, more and more countries that are being threatened with the Trump tariffs have actually changed and focused towards disconnecting from the U.S. altogether. And when that happens, they're going to look for alternatives. As they say, nature abhors a vacuum, and when power is removed, something's going to fill it. And the BRICS, as they already have 40% of the world's population, 40% of the world's economy, if not more, they're already trading more and more outside the dollar. It's going to open the door to bring in more countries, more nations that want to disconnect from the old system. And guess what? India, if they don't make the right choice, which it appears they're slowly starting to do, they could be left out in the cold.
Yeah, and they're going to have huge problems. And it's interesting with BRICS is that all this will do as well is accelerate the developments they've got underway to do with payment systems, to do with trading in local currencies, and actually obviously finding a way to effectively circumvent the IMF and the World Bank and to be able to finance, for example, infrastructure projects inside BRICS countries. Well, this is the US attitude will accelerate that enormously. So that is something else that is actually hugely beneficial to BRICS, who haven't, for me, worked fast enough to roll out certain developments. But I think increasingly since Trump came back into office, that's precisely what they are doing. But it also is the integration of Eurasian security in the SCO. It's extremely important that they actually really all understand that that the United States underpins a lot of the problems these countries have with in terms of their own domestic security, because they do not want, and the UK is involved as well, and we're not portioning all the blame on the US, which is to create massive instability. Because when Eurasia unites and Eurasia starts to develop with respect to BRICS integration, and there's about 30 more countries who want to join in various capacities, then you start to be able to have a region that will be able to maximize their trade and commerce, maximize their access to resources, maximize their military protection and capabilities to defend themselves against not World War III or anything like that, but against these threats of terrorist organizations that it's extremely questionable as to who's providing them with arms and financing them. And I'm not going to get into specifics of every group, but there has definitely been links to the West in this regard in the past. And, countries like India and Pakistan need to reconcile their differences and realize that they're not the problem with each other. The problem resides in the fact that the West and the United States particularly wants to ensure these countries never resolve their differences, because when they do, Eurasia will chart its own path. And when the US, and for that matter, the UK, is pushed out of Eurasia permanently, then it's absolutely game over for any aspirations they have about global hegemonic dominancy, which of course is rapidly vaporizing anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at from a historical view. The era of McAnder and the Atlanticists, coupled with the Wolfowitz Doctrine post uh, Cold War and no superpowers, is finally coming to a reckoning with BRICS and the decline of the Western world. Paul, were there any other ideas or topics you wanted to address regarding this?
No, I think that's fine.
Indeed. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.